The gavel came down like a gunshot. Kate Abbott stood on the raised wooden platform outside Ridge Creek Saloon, the afternoon sun of September 1878 beating down on the back of her neck like a brand, and she understood with cold, absolute clarity that she was being sold. Not her body, not entirely, but her labor, her freedom, her next 5 years of life, all of it wrapped up in a debt that had never truly been hers to begin with. Her stepfather, Gerald Moores, had borrowed $460 from the Ridge Creek Lending Company, a business run entirely by a man named Silas Prout who wore silk waistcoats and filed his nails and smiled like a man who had never once been told no. Gerald had drunk most of that money, gambled the rest, and then died of a bad heart on a Tuesday morning in August, leaving Kate nothing but the debt notice nailed to the door of the boarding house where she worked. She was 24 years old, brown-haired, green-eyed, and entirely alone. The auctioneer, a sweating man named Dobbs who clearly hated himself for being here, read aloud the terms of the indentured contract. 5 years of labor to whoever settled the debt in full. She would work wherever the buyer directed. She would not leave the county without written permission. She would not marry without the buyer's consent. Her wages, if any, would be applied against the original sum until it was clear. It was legal. That was the worst part. In the territories, debt contracts like this existed in the gray spaces between frontier law and outright cruelty, and Silas Prout knew exactly how to operate inside that gray space. There were 3 men bidding. One was the owner of a mining operation north of town who needed a cook and didn't care what it cost to get one. One was the foreman of a cattle ranch who wanted a seamstress and a laundress, and smiled at Kate in a way that made her stomach turn to ice. The third was Silas Prout himself, bidding quietly, steadily, as though this were nothing more than a land auction, as though the woman on the platform were a parcel of acreage. The bidding reached $480. Kate's hands were clasped in front of her. She did not shake. She had decided she would not shake. She would be present and she would survive and she would find a way out of this, and she would do all of those things without giving any of these men the satisfaction of her fear. Then the crowd shifted. She didn't hear him approach. Nobody seemed to. One moment the space at the back of the auction crowd was empty, and the next, Edgar Holloway was standing there, and the people near him had unconsciously stepped aside to make room, the way water parts for a stone dropped into still water. He was somewhere around 35 years old, weathered in the way that men who had lived hard outdoors got weathered, not old, but layered. His face was angular and sun-darkened, with a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a very long time and hadn't let go. He wore a dark trail coat despite the heat, and the handle of a Colt single-action Army revolver showed above his hip. His eyes were the color of the sky right before a storm, that particular gray-blue that isn't peaceful at all but is instead the color of something building. He walked forward through the crowd and people moved for him without being asked. He looked at Dobbs the auctioneer. He looked at Silas Prout. He looked at the platform where Kate stood. Then he reached into his coat, produced a leather wallet, and counted out bills onto the auctioneer's table without a word. $460. The exact sum of the original debt, not the inflated auction price, not Prout's bidding war price, the original debt. That covers what she owes, Edgar said. His voice was low and unhurried, like the sound a river makes in deep country where it has no reason to rush. Every cent of it. Prout turned from the bidding platform with the expression of a man who had been very carefully insulted. The bidding stands at $480, Mr. Holloway. If you wish to acquire the contract, you'll need to exceed the current offer. Edgar looked at him for a long moment. The debt is $460, he said. I've paid the debt. There is no contract. He looked at Kate then, and his voice did not change in tone, but something in it shifted. Something that was not loud and was not gentle but was deeply, immovably certain. She owes nothing to anyone. The silence that followed was the kind that happens in a town when something fundamental has just been declared, when the air itself seems to be deciding which way to fall. To understand how Edgar Holloway came to be standing in that crowd, and why Kate Abbott was on that platform in the first place, you have to go back 3 weeks. You have to go back to the night Gerald Moores died, and the morning Kate read the notice on the door, and understood that the world she had built, small as it was, modest as it was, had just been taken from under her feet. Kate had come to Ridge Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1876, 2 years before the events of that September auction. She had come with her mother, Eleanor, who had married Gerald Moores in Missouri and followed him west on the promise that a man who was restless in one place might find his footing in another. He hadn't. Eleanor had died of fever in the winter of 1877, and Kate had stayed in Ridge Creek because she had nowhere else to go, and because the work at the Delmont boarding house was honest and steady. She made beds, she cooked breakfasts, she mended linens, and she saved money the way a person saves when they know that money is the only wall between themselves and disaster. Gerald Moores had borrowed against Kate's name without her knowledge. She discovered this only after his death, when Silas Prout arrived at the boarding house with papers and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and explained, with the patient precision of a man who has delivered this particular speech many times, that the debt was legally attached to the household, and since Kate was the surviving member of that household, the debt was hers. She had gone to the sheriff, a round-faced man named Abner Culp, who had listened politely and then explained that Mr. Prout operated within the law and there wasn't much he could do. She had gone to the only lawyer in Ridge Creek, a man named Ferris who smelled of pipe tobacco and regret, who had looked at the papers and confirmed that while the situation was morally questionable, it was legally sound. She had tried to negotiate with Prout directly. He had smiled and said the debt auction was already scheduled. So Kate had stood on that platform with her hands clasped and her chin up and had told herself that whatever happened next, she would survive it. She had not counted on Edgar Holloway. Edgar had ridden into Ridge Creek 3 days before the auction for reasons that had nothing to do with Kate Abbott at the time. He was passing through on his way south, stopping to resupply, staying at the Delmont boarding house because it was the only respectable accommodation in town, and he had reached an age where sleeping on the trail felt like a punishment rather than an adventure. He had been a lawman once, in the years before the territory wars. A deputy marshal out of Abilene who had served for 7 years and built a reputation that was less about speed on the draw, though he was fast, genuinely fast, and more about a quality that people struggled to name and usually settled on calling stubborn righteousness. He had seen a lot of things done in the name of law that were not lawful, and a lot of things called justice that were not just. And eventually, he had turned in his badge and become the kind of man who drifted, not because he was running from anything in particular, but because he had not yet found the thing that made him want to stop. He had eaten breakfast at the Delmont boarding house on a Tuesday morning, and Kate Abbott had brought him coffee and eggs and corn bread, and he had said thank you, and she had said you are welcome, and that had been the entirety of their first exchange. But he had noticed things, because noticing things was a habit built into him at a level below conscious thought. He had noticed that she moved through the dining room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. He had noticed the slight tension in her shoulders that never fully released. He had noticed when she passed near enough that she was reading the debt notice she held in her apron pocket, her fingers touching the paper with the specific anxiety of someone returning compulsively to a thing that frightened them. He had not asked. It was none of his business. He had heard about the auction from a man named Tom Greer who worked the livery stable, and who had the specific talent of knowing every piece of news in Ridge Creek before it officially became news. Tom had told Edgar while Edgar was saddling his horse on Thursday morning, 2 days before the auction, told him the way people tell things in small towns, not with any particular agenda, just because it was the story of the moment and Edgar seemed like a man who listened. "They're auctioning off the Abbott woman," Tom had said, brushing a horse he didn't need to be brushing. "The one who works the boarding house. Prute's got a debt contract on her. Stepfather left her with it." Edgar had kept his hands moving on the saddle. She agreed to the debt. Lord no, didn't even know about it till the old man was in the ground. Edgar had ridden out of Ridge Creek that Thursday morning. He had ridden south for approximately 4 miles, which was the distance at which Ridge Creek disappeared behind a low ridge, and the Kansas prairie opened up in every direction into something that felt genuinely endless. He had sat there on his horse for a while, looking at the horizon. He had turned around and ridden back. He told himself it was because he didn't like the shape of a thing like that. He told himself it was the lawman instinct he couldn't fully extinguish, the inability to ride away from something that was wrong and dressed up in paperwork to look like it was right. He told himself it was principle, not particularity. He told himself a lot of things on that 4-mile ride back to Ridge Creek. What he knew, at a level he did not examine too closely yet, was that the way Kate Abbott moved through a room had not left his mind for 3 days, and that the thought of Silas Prute owning 5 years of her life made something cold and final settle into his chest. He went to Ferris the lawyer on Thursday afternoon and asked to see the debt documentation. Ferris, surprised by this request from a man he'd never seen before, had shown him the papers. Edgar had read them carefully, which was a habit from his years as a deputy, when reading documents carefully had sometimes been the difference between catching a criminal and letting a technicality set them free. The original debt amount was $460. The contract specified that the debt itself, not any subsequent auction proceeds, constituted the legal obligation. The auction was Prute's mechanism for profiting beyond the debt, by driving up the price through competitive bidding and pocketing the difference while still claiming the labor contract. It was legal in the sense that no specific law prohibited it, but the debt itself, the actual underlying obligation, was $460. If someone paid that amount directly, the contractual basis for the indenture evaporated. It was a narrow argument. It might not hold in a proper court, but in the territories in 1878, most legal disputes didn't go to proper courts. They went to whoever was most certain of their position and most willing to stand behind it. Edgar had $480 in his wallet, which was most of his savings from the previous year's work as a hired troubleshooter for a cattle company in Colorado. He counted out $460. He had spent the 2 days before the auction not talking to Kate Abbott, which he considered the appropriate thing to do since she didn't know him and he had no desire to alarm her. He had eaten his meals at the boarding house and paid attention and verified what Tom Greer had told him, and on Saturday morning he had walked to the auction and done what he did. The moment after he declared that Kate owed nothing to anyone, the crowd was silent. Then Silas Prute stepped forward, and the pleasantness was entirely gone from his face. "You've paid an amount," Prute said, "but the contract was entered into through the auction mechanism, and the auction has established the price at $480. You are $20 short of the obligation." "The obligation is the debt," Edgar said, "not the auction price. The auction was your invention, not the contract's requirement. The contract specifies the debt figure. I've paid the debt figure." He held Prute's gaze without blinking, and there was nothing threatening in his expression, nothing aggressive, just that quality of absolute immovability, as though he had decided this, and the deciding was permanent. "If you want to dispute that in a court of law, we can discuss it. I have the relevant section of the contract memorized." He did. He had read it 4 times. Prute looked at him for a long moment. Prute was not a stupid man, and he was reading Edgar the way predators read things they are not sure they can take. He was calculating odds. He was noting the way the crowd had shifted, the subtle tilt of public sentiment that can turn on a single dramatic moment. He was noting that Edgar Holloway had not raised his voice once and had not touched his gun, and still managed to make Prute feel as though he were the one at a disadvantage. "This is not settled," Pruitt said finally. No, Edgar agreed. But the debt is paid. He looked at Dobbs, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man desperately hoping to be elsewhere. Record it. Dobbs, apparently deciding that Edgar Holloway was more immediately frightening than Silas Pruitt, recorded it. Edgar walked to the platform where Kate still stood. He looked up at her from the ground, and for the first time she got a clear look at his face from above, the lines of it, the eyes, the expression that was not soft but was not hard either. It was something in between, something she didn't have a word for yet. "Miss Abbott," he said, "you're free to go." She came down the platform steps carefully, keeping her expression composed, and when she reached the ground she looked at him directly, because she was not a woman who looked away from things, even things that made her chest tight with something she couldn't immediately identify. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You spent nearly $500 on a woman you don't know." $460, he corrected. "Why?" He considered the question with the same careful deliberateness he applied to everything. "Because it was wrong," he said, "and I had the money." Kate looked at him for another moment. Around them the crowd was beginning to disperse, and she could feel Pruitt's eyes on her back like a brand. "That's not a complete answer," she said. The corner of his mouth moved very slightly. It was the closest thing to a smile she would see from him for some time. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They walked away from the platform together, not quite side by side, not quite apart, in the way of two people who are not yet sure what proximity to each other means. Kate had the presence of mind to feel, beneath the relief and the residual terror, and the shaky enormity of having just been auctioned in a public square, a deep and thorough fury. She had been put on that platform by a dead man's debts and a living man's greed, and the fact that she had been saved did not erase the humiliation of having needed saving. It existed inside her like a coal, not explosive, not dramatic, just steady and hot and slow burning. She also felt, whether she wanted to or not, something else that she recognized and immediately began to be suspicious of. Edgar Holloway had walked through a crowd for her. He had paid nearly $500 for her freedom. He had done it without making it about himself, without performing it, without asking her for anything in return. In her experience, men who did things for women always eventually asked for something in return, and the size of what they asked was usually proportional to the size of the gesture. She intended to be very watchful about this. They sat in the Delmont boarding house's small parlor that afternoon, in the careful stiffness of two strangers who have been thrown together by extraordinary circumstances and must now figure out how to talk to each other. Mrs. Delmont, the boarding house owner, brought them tea without being asked, with the air of someone who understood that something significant had just happened and wished to be adjacent to it. "I want to understand the terms," Kate said. She had her hands folded in her lap and her voice was steady. "You paid my debt, what do you expect now?" Edgar was quiet for a moment. He turned his cup in his hands. "Nothing," he said. "That is not how debts work," she said carefully. "I'm not Pruitt," he said. "I didn't buy a contract, I paid a debt. Those are different things." He looked at her directly. "You don't owe me anything, Miss Abbott, that's the point." She studied him. She was looking for the hidden motive, the angle she hadn't found yet, the thing that would reveal what kind of man this actually was underneath the gesture. She had known a lot of men in 24 years, and she had learned that the surface of a person was rarely the whole truth of them. "You're passing through," she said. It wasn't a question. "I was," he said. And now, he was quiet again. This quality of his, the pauses, the deliberateness, she had initially read as evasion. She was beginning to revise that. He wasn't evading questions. He was answering them honestly, which required him to actually know the answer before he spoke. "I'm less certain of my schedule than I was yesterday," he said. That afternoon, Kate helped in the boarding house kitchen with the kind of focused, physical purpose that was her particular mechanism for processing distress. She chopped vegetables for the evening stew, and she thought about Edgar Holloway, and she tried to be rational about the situation. He had paid her debt. He had asked for nothing. He had said she owed nothing. Those were facts. The other facts were these. She had $80 saved, which was not enough to leave Ridge Creek and establish herself somewhere else. Sela's Prout was not finished. She could feel that with certainty, the way you can feel a storm before it arrives. And she was, as of today, technically free, which meant she was also technically alone, and without the specific protection that even an unjust legal arrangement would have provided against Prout's other options. She was also, she admitted to herself while she was being honest, very aware of the fact that Edgar Holloway was sitting in the parlor reading a newspaper with the unhurried composure of a man who had done a large thing and felt no need to discuss it further. The first real conversation they had, not the careful, provisional exchange after the auction, but the kind of conversation that actually reveals people to each other, happened that evening on the boarding house porch. Kate had come out for air after the kitchen work, and he was already there, sitting on the porch rail with his hat off, looking at the street. In the softening light of early evening without the hat, she could see the silver at his temples, the way his face held its angles differently in softer light, less austere. She sat in the porch chair without much comment because she was tired, and because pretending she didn't want to sit near him seemed like more work than it was worth. "Where were you headed?" she asked. "Before you turned around." He looked at her. "You knew I turned around. Tom Greer told Mrs. Delmont you'd left Thursday morning," she said. "And then you were at breakfast Friday. Ridge Creek isn't big enough to arrive and leave and arrive without people noticing." "New Mexico," he said. "A man I used to work with runs a horse operation there. He'd offered me a position." "Why did you turn around?" He was quiet. The evening birds were loud in the elm trees along the street. "Because the situation was wrong," he said, "and I knew it was wrong, and knowing a thing is wrong and riding away from it anyway takes a toll that I'm no longer willing to pay." She turned this over in her mind. "That sounds like a man with a conscience he's had arguments with." "I have," he said. "I've lost most of them." "What does that mean?" So he told her, not all of it, not then, but the shape of it. The years as a deputy marshal. The cases he'd worked, the judgments he'd enforced, some of which he'd believed in and some of which he hadn't. The moment he'd realized that law and justice were not the same thing, and that he had been serving the former while assuming it was the latter. The badge he'd turned in on a March morning in 1875 after a case he didn't specify, but that had clearly been the final thing, the event that had tipped something irreversible inside him. "You've been drifting since then," she said. "Working," he said. "Cattle mostly, some hired protection work, freelance troubleshooting." He said troubleshooting with the faint self-consciousness of a man using a word that doesn't quite fit. "It sounds better than it is." "Does it pay well?" "Well enough. I had nearly $500 saved." She heard the past tense and felt the weight of what he'd done settle on her again, differently than it had before. Before it had been abstract, the gesture. Now she knew something about the man, and the gesture had specificity. He had spent almost all of what he had. "Edgar," she said, and it was the first time she used his name, and she heard it come out with a quality she hadn't intended, something almost careful, like she was testing whether the word fit. "Why really?" He turned to look at her, and in the evening light his eyes were less storm-colored, more like deep water. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not guarded but was not entirely open either, honest in the way of someone who is being honest right up to the edge of the thing that's hardest to say. "I saw you on that platform," he said, "holding yourself together, refusing to let them see you break. And I thought," he stopped, started again. "I thought that was the bravest thing I'd seen in a long time, and the most unjust thing I'd seen in an equally long time, and those two things together were not something I could ride away from." She looked at the street for a moment. The oil lamps were being lit at the far end of the block. A dog barked somewhere. "I wasn't brave," she said. "I was terrified." "That's what brave is," he said simply. That night in her small room at the boarding house, Kate Abbott lay awake for 2 hours and thought about the fact that a stranger had rearranged her entire life with $460 and a conviction, and that she was not sure whether this was rescue or something more complicated that just looked like rescue from the outside. She thought about Silas Pruitt's face when Edgar had said the debt was paid. She thought about the way Edgar had said she owes nothing to anyone, with that absolute certainty, as though he had the right to declare it, and then realized that for that moment he had. She thought about his eyes in the evening light. She told herself firmly that she was not going to be foolish about this. She also thought, with the practical part of her mind that never fully quieted, that Pruitt was not finished. A man like that, humiliated publicly, watching a significant money-making scheme collapse because of a stranger's legal argument and a clear wallet, that man was going to look for a different approach. She was right. 3 days later, Silas Pruitt came to the boarding house. Kate was in the front hall when he arrived, replacing candles in the wall sconces, and she heard his knock and opened the door herself and found him standing on the porch with his waistcoat and his filed nails and his smile. "Miss Abbott," he said, "I wonder if we might talk privately." "We might not," she said. His smile shifted, not disappearing but becoming something else, something with more edge in it. "I think you may want to hear what I have to say. It concerns the legitimacy of your release from the debt contract." "The debt was paid in full," she said, "in front of witnesses and recorded by the auctioneer." "What was paid was a contested amount," Pruitt said. "The auction mechanism established the legal price at $480. A court might have an interesting time deciding whether Mr. Holloway's payment was sufficient." He let that sit for a moment. "Or, and this is why I thought you might want to speak privately, we might arrive at an arrangement that makes the matter go away." "What kind of arrangement?" she said, very carefully. "You are, I believe, employed here at modest wages," Pruitt said. "You have savings. If you were to agree to a voluntary labor arrangement for, say, 2 years rather than 5, at somewhat better conditions than the auction contract." "No," she said. He blinked as though he hadn't expected that to be the first word. "I beg your pardon." "No," she said again. "I will not enter into any voluntary arrangement with you. I will not agree to any terms with you. And if you pursue me through a court, I will contest the case with every resource available to me." She paused. "I would also like you to leave this property." Pruitt's smile was entirely gone now. "You are in a precarious position, Miss Abbott, for someone making declarations." "Yes," she said, I'm very aware of that." Her voice was steady but her heart was going very fast. "And I'm still telling you no. Now please leave." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment, and the thing in his eyes during that moment was not pleasant to look at. Then he turned and walked down the porch steps and along the street without another word. Kate closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment, breathing. Edgar appeared in the hallway. He had apparently been in the parlor within earshot of the entire exchange. "You heard that," she said. "I did," he said. "You didn't come out." "You didn't need me to," he said. She looked at him. "He's going to go to a court." "He might," Edgar said. "Frontier courts are inconsistent. He might find a judge who rules in his favor." He paused. "He also might not." "If he does, I'm back where I started," she said. "Not exactly," Edgar said. "If he takes it to a court, I'll be there. And I have the contract language memorized, and I've faced more hostile legal environments than a territorial court." He held her gaze. "I'll deal with it." She looked at him for a moment. "You keep doing that," she said. "What?" "Acting as though my problems are yours to solve." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not how I see it," he said. "I see it as your problem is wrong and I know how to address wrong things. Those are two separate facts that happen to coincide." "That is a very careful way of saying something," she said. "I'm a careful man," he said. She knew that was true. She had been watching him for 3 days, with the specific attention she gave to things she was trying to understand, and careful was an accurate word. He was careful with everything, with words, with movements, with the space between himself and other people. He was careful in a way that suggested previous carelessness had cost him something. She wanted to know what that was. That evening she asked him about it, on the porch again, which was becoming their particular location for real conversations. The porch was neither inside nor outside, neither private nor public. It was a good place for things that hadn't been decided yet. "You're very controlled," she said. Everything about you is deliberate. What made you that way?" He was quiet for longer than usual. A horse went by on the street. Somewhere down the block someone was playing a harmonica badly. "I wasn't always," he said. "Earlier in my life I was less managed." He said it with a flatness that suggested he was choosing an understatement. "There was a woman, years ago. And I was young and very certain of myself in the way young men are, and I made choices that I convinced myself were righteous and were actually mostly selfish." He paused. "She was hurt by those choices. And when I understood that, really understood it, I became someone who thinks before he moves." "Where is she now?" Kate asked. "Married, Colorado, 2 children, perfectly happy." He said it without bitterness, with something more complex, a kind of resolution that had cost something to reach. "She deserved better than I was then. She got it." "And you've been being careful ever since," Kate said. "Trying to be," he said. She looked at him in profile, the angular face, the silver-touched temples, the hands resting on the porch rail. He was a man who had made himself deliberately, out of the parts of who he'd been and the knowledge of what that had done. She understood that kind of making. She had done something similar herself, in the years after her mother died and Gerald Moores became the horizon of her situation. "I do the same thing," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I'm very controlled too," she said. "On that platform I thought if I showed them what I was feeling they would have won something. So I held everything in and kept my chin up and told myself I was surviving it." She paused. "I think I might have been performing survival rather than actually surviving. I'm not entirely sure there's a difference." "There is," he said. "You were surviving. The performance was just how it looked from the outside." She thought about that. She thought about the fact that she was telling a man she'd known for 5 days something she hadn't said to anyone. She thought about the fact that this didn't alarm her as much as she thought it probably should. "Edgar," she said. "Yes. I am very suspicious of you." "I know," he said, without any indication of offense. "I think you're a good man," she continued carefully. "And I think you did what you did because you meant it. And I am still suspicious because in my experience the men who seem good are waiting for the moment when that stops being true." He was quiet. Then he said, "That's a fair position." "I know it is," she said. "I won't tell you not to have it," he said. "I'll just try to be consistent." She laughed briefly, genuinely. It surprised her, the laugh and the fact that it was real. "Try to be consistent," she repeated. "That's your reassurance." "It's the only honest one," he said. She decided she liked his honesty more than she'd liked most men's charm. Over the following week, Ridge Creek watched them with the interested attention of a town that has recently witnessed a dramatic public act and is curious about its implications. Mrs. Delmont, who liked Kate and had a romantic imagination that she cultivated secretly behind a practical exterior, began finding reasons for Kate to serve Edgar's table at breakfast rather than have the girl do it. Tom Greer at the livery would mention to anyone who'd listened that Holloway was a good man, had known it from the first, and was choosing to stay in Ridge Creek because of clear reasons that Tom would describe with significant eyebrow movements. The reality was both simpler and more complicated than the town's version of it. What was happening was this. Kate Abbott and Edgar Holloway were spending time in each other's company and discovering that each of them was the specific kind of person the other one could talk to. This was, in its way, a more extraordinary event than the auction rescue, because it is far rarer to find someone you can actually talk to than someone who will do something dramatic on your behalf. They talked about everything. They talked about law and what it was, and what it should be, and the distance between those things. They talked about the frontier territories and what was happening to the land, and the people who had lived on it before the people who called it frontier arrived. Edgar had strong views on the injustices of westward expansion that surprised her, given that he had been a lawman who enforced some of those systems. He spoke about it with the particular discomfort of a man who had been part of something wrong for years before he understood it was wrong, and the understanding hadn't arrived cleanly or neatly. They talked about what Kate wanted for her life, which was a question no one had asked her in a very long time. She wanted, she said, to have something of her own. Not large, she was not a woman with large ambitions in the material sense. A small business, perhaps. She had thought about a millinery shop, because she had a skill for hat construction that she'd learned from a woman in Missouri and had never had the capital to develop. She had thought about a laundry service, which was consistently needed in any frontier town and required relatively modest startup investment. She wanted, and she said this with a kind of controlled fierceness that he found striking, not to be dependent on someone else's goodwill for her survival. He listened to all of it with the quality of attention that she was learning was his particular gift. Not just patient listening, but real listening, the kind that processes and retains and responds to what was actually said rather than what was expected. He talked about what he wanted, which was something he had not thought about in years. He had been surviving too, in his own way, just with a wider range of motion. He talked about the horse operation in New Mexico, the friend who'd offered him a position. He talked about it with a complicated tone, affection for the idea, ambivalence about the execution. "You don't actually want to go to New Mexico," Kate said one evening. He looked at her with a slight expression of someone caught being transparent. "I'm not sure." "I think you turned back before you even got there," she said. "Not because of the auction, or not only because of the auction. I think you turned back because you weren't going towards something, you were just going, and a reason to stop felt better than no reason at all." He was quiet for a moment. "When did you get this perceptive about me?" "I've been watching you," she said without any apology. "You watch me, I watch back. What else have you seen?" He asked, and there was something new in his voice, not quite vulnerable, but less armored than usual. She looked at him for a moment. She was aware of the specific quality of the evening light, the way it was warm on the porch, the way the end of September had turned the air cooler so that the warmth felt precious. She was aware of the particular configuration of the two of them, alone on the porch in the half-dark, the town quieted down for the night. "I think you're lonely," she said. "I think you've been lonely for a long time and managed it so well that you've almost convinced yourself you're just independent." He looked at her. Something moved in his face, something that was not quite pain and not quite relief, the expression of someone who has been seen clearly and is deciding what to do with that. "Kate," he said. "Yes, He stopped. He looked at his hands, he looked at her. "I am very careful," he said. "You already know that, and I don't want to be careful with you in a way that's actually cowardice dressed up as respect. So I'll say the true thing, which is that I have not wanted to stay anywhere in a very long time, and I want to stay here." A pause. "I want to stay near you." She felt this land in her chest carefully in the space she had been keeping guarded. She breathed it in. "I want you to stay," she said. "I'm still suspicious of you, I know. But I want you to stay." He nodded. In the dark, his eyes were serious and still. "I'll stay," he said, "and I'll be consistent." She laughed again, and this time it came with something warmer in it, something that was beginning to look a lot like joy. Silas Prout did not go to court. What he did, 2 weeks after the auction, was more direct and more dangerous. He sent 2 men to the boarding house on a Thursday night when he had, apparently, determined that Edgar was at the Ridge Creek Saloon. The 2 men were hired hands of the mining operation north of town, men who owed Prout money and therefore owed Prout favors. And what they were sent to do was threaten Kate into signing a new voluntary debt agreement that Prout had prepared. What Prout had not determined correctly was that Edgar had left the saloon early that night because Edgar rarely stayed anywhere he wasn't comfortable. And the Ridge Creek Saloon had become uncomfortable when Prout's foreman walked in and began watching the room with the specific watchfulness of someone keeping track of where a particular person was. Edgar had come back to the boarding house, noted the lights still on in the front parlor, and was about to go around to the side door when he heard voices that weren't right. He came through the front door instead. The 2 men were in the parlor. Kate was standing at the far side of the room, and she had a fireplace poker in her hand. One of the men was holding the contract document. The other man was closer to her, not touching her but in the aggressive proximity that is its own kind of force. "Step back from her," Edgar said. His voice was entirely level. It was not a shout, and it was not a warning, and it was not a threat. It was a statement of what was going to happen, with the same immovability of his declaration at the auction, and it had the same effect on the air. Both men stepped back. Edgar didn't touch his gun. He didn't need to. He stood in the doorway with the specific quality of a man for whom violence is a last resort but not an unknown country, and looked at the two men with an expression that communicated without ambiguity that this was over. "Leave the paper," he said. "Get out of this house. Tell Prout whatever you need to tell him." They left. Kate set the poker down with a clang that was slightly louder than necessary, and then she sat down in the nearest chair because her legs had made a decision without consulting her. Edgar crossed the room and crouched in front of her, looking up at her face. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "I was about to hit him with the poker." "I saw that," he said. "I was actually going to do it," she said, with a firmness that was probably compensating for the way her hands were shaking now that the immediate need for them to be steady was over. "I know," he said. He was looking at her with an expression that was careful and warm at once, the way you look at something you are both worried about and proud of simultaneously. Without thinking about it, he took her shaking hands in his. They both felt the specific weight of this. His hands around hers, the warmth of it, the steady quality of his touch after the chaos of the last 5 minutes. "Prout has to be dealt with," Edgar said practically, because he was a practical man even in moments that were not entirely practical. "Yes," she said. "I have an idea about that," he said, "but I want to ask you first. It requires something from you." She looked at him. "Ask." He had been thinking about this since the day after the auction. He had been thinking about it carefully, considering it from multiple angles, the way he considered things. "Prout's leverage is the debt claim," he said. "He believes it's still contestable, which is why he keeps pushing. The cleanest way to make it definitively not his business anymore is to establish that you have a legal protector with standing in the community." He paused. "I'm asking you to marry me, Kate. Not as a forced choice or a practical arrangement. I'm asking because I want to marry you. But I'm telling you the practical argument so that you can weigh it separately from the other argument and decide without confusion." She stared at him. "You've known me for 3 weeks," she said. 17 days, he said. "Yes. You are asking me to marry you after 17 days. I know the timeline," he said. "I know it sounds. It sounds like a man who is accustomed to making quick decisions about complicated things," she said. "In my defense," he said, "most of those decisions have been correct." She looked at him. He was still crouching in front of her with her hands in his, and there was something in his expression that was beyond the careful architecture of his usual face, something that was opened up, exposed, the specific vulnerability of a man who has said the real thing and is now waiting to hear if it was received. She thought about the 17 days. She thought about everything he had said and everything she had learned. She thought about the quality of knowing someone, which is not always a function of time but of attention, and she had paid close attention, and so had he, and what she knew about Edgar Holloway was enough. It was more than enough. It was more than she had known about anyone in her life, and she had taken years to know them. She thought about her own heart, which she had been watching carefully for 17 days in the way you watch a fire you are not sure you should feed. She was going to feed it. "The practical argument is irrelevant," she said. "I'm not marrying you because of Prout." "I know," he said. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. But I am marrying you," she said. "If you'll be consistent." The corner of his mouth moved. The smile again, fuller than before, changing the whole geography of his face. "I'll be consistent," he said. She leaned forward and kissed him, gently, briefly, the first kiss, calibrated exactly to the weight of the moment, which was large and significant and deserved to be acknowledged with something real rather than something showy. When she pulled back, his hands tightened around hers briefly, and the expression on his face was one she stored in her chest like something precious. They were married 3 days later at the Ridge Creek Justice of the Peace. It was a small affair. Mrs. Delmont attended, and Tom Greer, and a woman named Bess Hartley who ran the dry goods store and had befriended Kate in her first months in Ridge Creek. The justice of the peace was a man named Wheeler, who was not notably sentimental, but managed to perform the ceremony with a dignity that suited the occasion. Edgar wore his best shirt, which was dark blue and had been laundered by Kate that morning over his mild protest, and he stood at the small desk in Wheeler's office and looked at Kate as she said her vows with a steadiness and a certainty that was entirely characteristic of her, and felt something shift in his chest that he recognized as the sensation of a man arriving somewhere he had been unknowingly traveling toward for a long time. Kate wore the dark green dress that was her best, and she spoke her vows clearly, looking at him. And what she was thinking was that this was either the most rational decision she had ever made or the most irrational, and she was entirely unable to determine which, and she found, to her own surprise, that she didn't care. She was happy. Genuinely, uncomplicated, present-tense happy, which was a condition she hadn't experienced in long enough that she had almost stopped expecting it. Silas Prout received the news of the marriage through the reliable mechanism of Ridge Creek's gossip network, and came to a calculation that Edgar had anticipated. A married woman with a husband who was a former deputy marshal and who had already demonstrated both legal knowledge and personal immovability was a significantly less attractive target than an isolated woman with a contested debt. The legal argument that the original payment had been sufficient was more persuasive in the hands of a man with standing and resources than it had been in the moments after the auction. Prout did not abandon the matter immediately. He spent another 2 weeks testing the edges of it, sending signals through intermediaries, making oblique references to courts and claims. Each time, Edgar responded through legitimate channels: a visit to the county seat, a consultation with a more senior lawyer than Ferris, a letter to the territorial marshal's office flagging Prout's debt auction practices as potentially worth examination. That last item was the one that decided it. Prout, who depended on operating in the gray spaces of frontier law, did not want the actual law to become interested in him. He let the matter go. Kate knew the moment it was truly over, because she stopped feeling Prout's shadow on every day. She felt the absence of it the way you feel a wound healing, not the dramatic reversal of a single moment, but the gradual, cumulative relief of weight lifting. She and Edgar had taken 2 rooms at the boarding house as their temporary accommodation, which was modest and slightly awkward given that they were newlyweds, but Kate had a practicality about these things that Edgar admired and matched. They were building something, and building required patience. Edgar had enough money left after the debt payment and the wedding expenses, barely, to consider a more permanent situation. Kate had her $80. Together they had a sum that was not large but was not nothing. Kate had not abandoned the idea of the millinery shop. The conversation about it happened in early October, 3 weeks after the wedding, when the Kansas autumn had turned the air crisp and the trees along Ridge Creek's Main Street were in their brief, brilliant color. Ridge Creek has no milliner, Kate said. She was not proposing this casually. She had been making notes for 2 weeks, prices for supplies, projected demand, the square footage she would need. She laid these out on the small table in their rooms with the precision of someone who has been planning things without any assurance that anyone would listen. Edgar looked at the notes. He took them seriously, which she had by now learned to expect but still appreciated. He read the projections. He asked questions, practical questions, logistical questions that she had mostly already thought about. "The startup cost," he said. "I can do it for $60, she said. "A small space. I'd start with basic materials and build inventory from profit." She paused. "I know how to build it slowly." "What would you need beyond the 60? He asked. "Someone to vouch for a small line of credit at the dry goods store," she said. "Bess Hartley has said she'd consider it, but she'd want a co-signatory." He nodded. "I'll do it." She looked at him. "I'm going to pay it back from the business." "I know you are," he said. "I want that to be clear," she said. "I'm not taking charity. This is a loan with an expectation of repayment. Kate, he said. Yes. I know, he said. I know exactly who you are. You don't have to establish that. She relaxed slightly in the way she did when she remembered that he actually did know who she was, that she didn't have to defend herself to him the way she had learned to defend herself to most people. The millinery shop opened in November of 1878, in a small space adjacent to the dry goods store that Bess Hartley helped her negotiate a lease on. It was a single room with 2 windows facing the street, and Kate painted the sign herself, Abbott Millinery. She used her maiden name deliberately, which Edgar understood, and which neither of them felt the need to discuss at length. The business was slow at first, then steady, then genuinely good. Kate had a skill that Ridge Creek turned out to need, and a manner with customers that was direct and warm in equal measure, and within 6 months she had repaid the credit line and was operating in the black. Edgar, in the meantime, had found his own footing in Ridge Creek. He had not planned to be a lawman again, and he was not, technically. But he was known, and his reputation was known, and word had spread through the county about what he'd done at the auction. Not the romantic version of it, though that existed too, but the legal version. The version about a man who knew how to read a contract and was willing to stand in front of a hostile crowd and make a narrow argument stick. The county commissioner, a man named Aldous Burke, had approached him in December about consulting on a dispute between 2 ranching operations. Then a cattle company had hired him to investigate a foreman they suspected of fraud. Then the sheriff, Abner Culp, who had failed Kate so comprehensively before the auction, had, apparently embarrassed by that failure, asked Edgar if he'd consider a deputy position. Edgar had declined the deputy position. He had explained to Kate why, carefully, the old reasons about law versus justice. She had listened and agreed, and suggested that consulting work was probably better suited to a man of his temperament than any official capacity would be. And he had looked at her with the expression he had when she said something that was entirely true, and that he was glad someone else had articulated. They were building, slowly and with the specific care of 2 people who had both learned that things built too quickly tend to fall, but they were building. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold, as Kansas winters were. They moved out of the boarding house in January into a small house on the east edge of Ridge Creek that Edgar had negotiated a purchase on, a 2-room structure with a proper stove, and a porch, and a view of the eastern prairie that Kate had fallen in love with the moment she saw it. The house became, over the following months, the first place Kate had lived since her mother's house in Missouri that felt genuinely like hers. Not hers by default, not hers because she was stuck there, but hers because she had chosen it and made it and was making it more each week. She put curtains on the windows that she made from fabric she'd selected herself. She planted herbs in the strip of ground along the south side. She hung 2 pieces of artwork modest, affordable, that she had bought from a traveling peddler who dealt in prints. She also watched Edgar settle, in the way a man settles when he has been unsettled for a very long time and has finally stopped. He fixed things that needed fixing. He built a proper shelf for the kitchen without being asked. He sat on their porch in the evenings, their porch now, not the borrowed porch at the boarding house, and looked at the eastern prairie with an expression that was no longer searching. The first time she told him she loved him, it was not a dramatic moment. It was a February morning, the stove going against the cold, Edgar at the kitchen table with coffee and papers from a consulting case, Kate about to leave for the shop. She had her coat half on and she stopped in the doorway and he looked up at her and she looked at him and she said it. "I love you, Edgar." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was very open and very serious, the same expression from the porch the night of the proposal but deeper, settled in, not tentative anymore. "I love you, Kate," he said, simply. "Certainly." She finished putting on her coat and went to the shop and was, all morning, in the particular warm privacy of a person who has just exchanged with someone else the most important true thing. That spring, Kate discovered she was pregnant. She told Edgar on a Sunday morning, when the May sunlight was coming through the kitchen windows at the angle that made the room golden. She told him directly, watching his face, and what she saw was not the complicated mixture of emotions she had half braced for, but something simpler and more complete: joy, steady and immediate, the expression of a man for whom this news was exactly welcome. He stood up from the table and crossed the room and held her carefully with all the deliberateness of everything he did, and she put her face against his neck and felt, under the warmth and the happiness, something she recognized as the specific relief of being in the right place when large things happen. "Are you well?" he asked into her hair. "Perfectly well," she said. "Are you happy?" he asked. She pulled back to look at him. "Profoundly," she said. The pregnancy was not easy in the particular way Kansas summers are not easy: the heat, the dust, the relentlessness of a climate that doesn't moderate for individual circumstances. Kate worked at the shop until July, when the summer heat made the days long and difficult, and then she handed the day-to-day operation to a young woman named Clara whom she'd been training since March, and she rested, which was something she did with visible difficulty, because she was a woman constitutionally opposed to inactivity. Edgar, during this period, was more present than ever. His consulting work he arranged around the rhythms of home, taking cases that allowed him to stay within a day's ride of Ridge Creek. He learned to make coffee exactly as Kate liked it, which was strong and slightly sweet, and brought it to her in the mornings. He sat with her on the porch in the evenings, which was their habit still, the porch their particular territory for the real conversations, and talked about the future in terms that were no longer provisional. They talked about the child. They talked about names. Edgar said he had a preference, but he'd defer to Kate, which was his way of saying he had a preference, but he knew whose labor this was. Kate said she wanted to hear his preference. He said, after the customary pause, that if it was a boy, he had always liked the name James, which was his father's name. She said she liked it too, and that they'd revisit it if it wasn't a boy. It was a boy. James Robert Holloway arrived on the 23rd of September, 1879, exactly 1 year and 3 days after the auction that had changed both of his parents' lives. He arrived in the early morning with the assistance of the Ridge Creek midwife, a competent woman named Agnes who had delivered half the children in the county and had strong opinions about everything. He arrived loudly, which Agnes said was a good sign. Kate held him in the morning light and was struck, as she had not fully expected to be, by the absolute specificity of love, not the general warm idea of it, but the sharp, particular, absolute reality of this child, this person, this new inhabitacy of the world. Edgar sat next to her on the edge of the bed, and held his son with a carefulness that had nothing to do with uncertainty, and everything to do with the specific care of someone who understands that the most important things require the most attention. He looked at the baby and then at Kate, and the expression on his face was one she would remember clearly for the rest of her life, stripped of all the careful layers, all the architecture of control and deliberateness, purely and wholly moved. "James," Kate said softly. "James," Edgar agreed. Mrs. Delmont brought food. Bess Hartley came with a quilt she had made, which was yellow and blue and more beautiful than anything the dry goods store sold. Tom Greer came to the door with his hat in his hands and a grin that was enormous and entirely undignified, and Kate laughed from her bed hearing Edgar explain patiently to Tom that yes, they were all well, thank you, Tom. Life after James arrived found a new rhythm. Kate went back to the shop in November, taking James with her in the mornings for the first months, because she found that she could not be away from him entirely and also could not stay away from the work entirely, and the shop was hers, and she could make it accommodate both. Clara, the young woman she'd trained, had proven herself capable of managing the shop independently and was pleased to have a baby in the back room some mornings, which she found diverting. Edgar's consulting work had grown, quietly and without any particular effort on his part, into something that constituted a genuine professional reputation. He was known in the county and beyond as a man who could assess a complicated situation, a land dispute, a contested account, a case of apparent fraud with precision and impartiality, and whose assessments held up under scrutiny. He turned down cases that required him to be away for more than 3 days. This was a personal rule he'd established and held to. The house on the east edge of Ridge Creek had, over the first year, become too small in the pleasant way of a house that is full rather than the difficult way of one that is merely cramped. Edgar extended the kitchen in the fall of 1879 with the help of 2 men he'd hired, and added a proper room for James, which Kate furnished with the care she gave to things she was making for someone she loved deeply. Silas Prout, for anyone who was wondering, had left Ridge Creek by the spring of 1879. The territorial marshal's office had indeed found his debt auction practices worth examining, and while no formal charges had been filed, the examination had been uncomfortable enough that Prout had relocated his operations to a town further west and further from scrutiny. Kate had heard about his departure from Bess Hartley and had felt, not triumph exactly, but the clean satisfaction of a problem being resolved. There remained, of course, the occasional complexity. Life in the frontier territories in 1879 was not without its difficulties, and Kate and Edgar were not exempt from these. Edgar's reputation meant that not everyone in the county was his friend. There were men whose interests he had opposed in his consulting work, men who had wanted a dispute resolved in their favor and found it resolved otherwise, men who held grudges. He was aware of this and managed it with his characteristic care, and Kate was aware of it too and matched his awareness with her own, because she was not a woman who turned away from the difficult facts of her situation. There was one incident in the spring of 1880 when a man named Court Hughes, who had lost a significant land case through Edgar's assessment, came to the Holloway house with grievances and alcohol in him. Edgar had handled it quietly, firmly, and without violence, which was his preference, and afterward had sat with Kate on the porch and talked through the situation with the completeness they'd always brought to difficult things. "Are you worried?" she asked. "About Hughes?" "No," he said. "He's angry, not dangerous. There's a difference." "You've always been good at that distinction," she said. "I've had years of practice," he said. He looked at the prairie. "I won't let anything touch this," he said quietly without drama, as a statement of fact about his intentions. "Not Hughes, not anyone." "I know," she said, "but Edgar, I can take care of myself too." "I know that better than anyone," he said. "You were holding a fireplace poker." She laughed. "I was going to use it." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm not worried." James Holloway learned to walk in April of 1880, approximately 1 month earlier than Agnes, the midwife, had predicted, which she took as a professional affront, and Edgar found privately delightful. He was a serious child, in the way that babies born to serious people sometimes are, with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's observant stillness. And he was adored in Ridge Creek with the comprehensive affection of a town that had watched his parents' story from the beginning and felt some proprietary warmth for its outcome. Kate, watching her son take his first steps across the kitchen floor, felt the particular richness of a life that had been built from the ground up, out of chosen things, in the presence of a person who truly saw her. She thought, not often but with gratitude when she did, about the auction platform, the gavel, Prout's smile, the crowd. She thought about the moment Edgar had walked through it. She thought about the specific courage it had taken to accept what he offered, not because accepting generosity was difficult in principle, but because accepting it from a man you barely knew, in a situation that required you to trust when trust had always cost something, had been the real risk. Not the auction, not Prout, that. She thought about the fact that she had taken the risk and it had been true, all of it. The consistency he had promised and delivered. The man he was, which had not changed or disguised itself or revealed a different face over time the way she'd half expected. He was exactly what he appeared, and what he appeared was more than she dared to want. She found him in the parlor that evening, their parlor now, which had books and a decent lamp and a chair that had become specifically Edgar's. And she stood in the doorway watching him read, James on his knee half asleep in the particular boneless way of tired toddlers, and she thought that this was exactly it. This was the thing she'd been trying to build since before she knew it was what she was building. She crossed the room and sat beside him, and he made room without looking up from his book, which was the specific kind of intimacy that belongs to long comfortable love, the kind that doesn't require ceremonies to confirm it. Edgar, she said. Yes. I want another baby, she said. He put the book down. He looked at her. The expression on his face was the full one, the open one, the one without the architecture. When, he said. Soon, she said. When James is sleeping through the night with consistency. He's close, Edgar said. He is, she agreed. They sat with James between them in the lamplight, and outside the Kansas evening was settling over the prairie with the specific softness of May, and the porch was available and familiar, and would be there tomorrow and the day after, and everything that had been open was closed, and everything that had been threatening was gone. And the life they were making was exactly as real and full and chosen as the best lives are. The second baby came in the spring of 1882, when James was 2.5 and had strong opinions about most things. This one was a girl, which Edgar had privately expected, and Kate had suspected without dwelling on it. They named her Eleanor, for Kate's mother, which Kate had thought about for a long time, and Edgar had agreed to without hesitation when she proposed it. Eleanor Abbott Holloway arrived in March, during the particular quality of late winter that Kansas produces, still cold, with intimations of warmth that aren't quite ready to commit, the world undecided. She arrived more quietly than James had, at mid-morning, with a placid efficiency that Agnes the midwife approved of. She had Kate's green eyes, and everyone immediately agreed, a personality of specific determination that suggested she had not come into the world without opinions. James regarded his sister with the wariness of a firstborn who has been warned but not truly prepared, and then, within 24 hours, with the wholesale devotion that siblings sometimes arrive at by the most direct possible route. He sat beside her with a seriousness that was entirely his father's, and touched her hand with a gentleness that was, Kate thought, something he had absorbed from the atmosphere of being raised by two people who paid careful attention to what they touched. The shop, Abbott Millinery, still hers, had by 1882 expanded into the adjacent space, making it twice the size of the original room, employing Clara full-time and a part-time girl named Ruthie, who was learning the trade with the specific eagerness of someone who has found their thing. Kate worked 4 days a week and managed the bookkeeping and supplier relationships from home on the 5th, which was an arrangement that satisfied the part of her that needed to be building something and the part of her that needed to be present for the people she was building it for. Edgar's consulting work had evolved, over the 4 years since the auction, into a recognized professional role. He had been asked twice more to consider formal law enforcement positions, and had declined both times for reasons that hadn't changed. What he did instead was consult, advise, assess, and occasionally act in unofficial capacities that kept the frontier moving without requiring him to be an arm of systems he didn't wholly trust. He was good at it. He was known, and known well, and the knowledge of him was specific enough that it was its own kind of protection. He had, in those 4 years, become something that he had not been when he rode into Ridge Creek in September of 1878. He had become a man in a place, a man with stakes and roots and the specific gravity of belonging somewhere. He had not expected to find this in a Kansas town he'd been passing through. He had not expected to find it in the form of a woman holding a fireplace poker in the dark. He had not expected it to feel so entirely like the right thing, so complete. He thought about it on the porch sometimes in the evenings, while the prairie did its slow, magnificent thing in the fading light. Kate beside him. James on the step below, absorbed in something small and fascinating, the way small children are. Elinor eventually in his arms, looking at the world with her green eyes and her uncompromising expression. He thought about the man who had ridden away on a Thursday morning, the man who had almost gone to New Mexico. He thought about the 4-mile point on the road south where something conscience, instinct, the particular pull of something he didn't have a word for yet, had made him turn around. He thought about how close it had been, how entirely different everything would be if he had not turned around. On their 4th anniversary, September of 1882, Edgar gave Kate a gift that he had been preparing since summer. It was a deed. The small house on the east edge of Ridge Creek, which they had been purchasing on an installment agreement, was now fully paid. The deed was in her name alongside his Kate Abbott Holloway, property holder, Ridge Creek, Kansas. Legal, documented, permanent. She had looked at the deed for a long time without saying anything, which was unusual for her. He waited because he was a man who knew how to wait. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "Something of my own," she said. "Ours," he said, "but yours too." She put her hand on his face, which was a gesture she'd developed over 4 years that meant more than she typically said in words, a touch that was claiming and gentle and completely certain. "You turned around," she said. She'd never told him she knew about the 4 miles, about the road south. He looked at her with a slight expression of someone who has been very accurately found out. "Yes," he said. "What made you?" He thought about it in his way, honestly, all the way down to the real answer. "You," he said. "Not you specifically, I didn't know you, but the idea of you, the woman on that platform who wouldn't let them see her break." He looked at her. "I needed to see what happened next." She kissed him on their porch on their 4th anniversary, with James playing somewhere in the yard behind the house and Elinor asleep in the cradle inside, and the September prairie stretching out beyond the east edge of Ridge Creek in every shade of gold and amber, and the blue of the particular sky that is specific to Kansas in autumn. It was a good kiss, the kind that belongs to people who know each other down to the bone and have chosen each other with full knowledge and are still, 4 years in, finding new dimensions to that choosing. The kind that is not desperate or searching but is entirely present. 2 people in a full life who have taken the risk and been met by the true thing. The boarding house still stood on Ridge Creek's main street, and Mrs. Delmont still ran it with her practical exterior and her secretly romantic interior. And the porch that Kate and Edgar had used for their first real conversations was still there, available, in the way that places are available that have been significant, as though they retain something of what happened on them. Tom Greer was still at the livery, still the most reliably informed person in Ridge Creek, still prone to significant eyebrow movements when discussing the Holloways, which he did frequently, and with the air of a man who feels a legitimate proprietary interest. Bess Hartley's dry goods store still extended credit to Abbott Millinery, which still repaid it with the specific promptness of Kate Abbott, who was not a woman who forgot what she owed and to whom. And Ridge Creek, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, was a place where a former deputy marshal and a milliner lived on the east edge of town, in a house that was fully paid for and full of children and books and the smell of coffee, and where the porch faced the prairie, and where the evenings were long and the conversations were real, and where 2 people who had both survived the particular loneliness of building a wall between themselves and disaster had found in each other a reason to stop building walls and start building something else instead, something better, something chosen. Something that had begun with a gavel coming down, and a man walking through a crowd, and a declaration spoken in a low, unhurried voice to a hostile audience, and a woman who owed nothing to anyone. Something that had become, over 4 years and 2 children and 100 porch evenings and 1 small house on the eastern edge of the prairie, a life. Their life. Theirs entirely and entirely enough. In the years that followed, as Kansas itself changed, as the frontier filled in and the territories became less wild and more settled, as the cattle drives gave way to homesteads, as the law that Edgar had always complicated his relationship with became more consistent and less arbitrary. The Holloway family grew alongside it. James grew into a boy of quiet intensity and sharp intelligence, who had his mother's green eyes and his father's way of thinking before he spoke, and who was universally liked in Ridge Creek in the specific way of children who managed to be both interesting and kind. Eleanor grew into a girl of such absolute certainty about her own opinions that Kate would look at her sometimes with an expression that Edgar recognized as the expression of someone seeing themselves clearly. They had a third child in 1885, another boy, whom they named William, and he arrived with a cheerfulness that was entirely his own, not his father's careful deliberateness or his mother's controlled intensity, but something lighter, an easiness of temperament that made him his siblings' favorite companion and his parents' constant source of surprise. The shop expanded twice more. By the time the 1880s were ending, Abbott Millinery was the best-known hat shop in 3 counties, and Kate had become a figure in the town's commercial life, in the way that women who build genuine things become figures. Respected not in spite of, but partly because of the story that had started at an auction platform. The story that everyone in Ridge Creek knew, and told with the specific satisfaction of a community that witnessed something significant and is glad it did. Edgar had, by 1886, written a small practical guide on debt contract law in the territories, a document that circulated among frontier lawyers and was eventually cited in 3 territorial court cases. He had not set out to write it. He had started making notes as he'd always made notes, and Kate had read them one evening and said, "You should finish this." And he had, because she was rarely wrong about things like that. Abner Culp, the sheriff who had failed Kate before the auction and who had spent the subsequent years in a state of mild but persistent embarrassment about that failure, eventually got a dog. Edgar helped him name it. This was not historically significant but was personally meaningful to Culp, who wrote it in his journal. The porch on the east edge of Ridge Creek remained their particular territory. Evening after evening, through the Kansas seasons, the fierce summers and the cold winters and the extravagant, brief beauty of spring and fall, Kate and Edgar sat on their porch and talked about the things that needed talking about and sat in silence about the things that didn't. They watched their children grow in the particular peripheral awareness of parents who are paying attention to each other, and to their kids simultaneously, the rare and sustainable balance of a marriage that has not sacrificed one for the other. There was not, in this life, the absence of difficulty. There was not the absence of loss. In 1883, Kate's friend Bess Hartley lost her husband to a sudden illness, and Kate was present for all of it, the grief and the after-grief and the slow remaking. In 1884, Edgar's former colleague from his deputy days wrote with news that the friend in New Mexico, the one with the horse operation, the one Edgar had been riding toward when he turned back, had died in an accident, and Edgar had been quiet for a day and then told Kate about it, fully, and she had listened in the way she did. And the next morning they had been back on the porch and the world had continued. There was not the absence of the ordinary frustrations of a life shared between 2 people who are both, in their ways, strong-willed and certain. They disagreed. They had arguments that were real arguments, not the performed kind, and they resolved them with the same quality of attention they brought to the things they agreed about. The commitment to honesty that had characterized their first conversations had not diminished with familiarity. If anything, it had deepened, become easier, the honesty of people who are no longer afraid of what the other person might do with the truth. What there was, in this life, was sufficiency. Not the sufficiency of people who have given up wanting more, but the sufficiency of people who have the things that matter and know it, and have the wisdom to live inside that knowledge rather than beside it. On an evening in September of 1887, 9 years after the auction, Kate and Edgar sat on the porch as the light went the slow amber of Kansas dusk. James was 13 and was inside reading, as he habitually was. Eleanor was 10 and was, as she habitually was, involved in some project in the yard that required sticks and string and her brother William's enthusiastic participation. William was 2 and contributed mainly volume. Edgar had his coffee. Kate had her tea. The prairie was doing its magnificent ordinary thing. 9 years, Kate said. Since the auction, he said. Since you turned around, she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the prairie, and then he turned to look at her in the evening light, and the expression on his face was the full one, the open one, the one that was all the layers stripped away to the thing itself. Best decision I ever made, he said. She looked at him. She thought about 24 years old and a platform and a gavel and a debt that wasn't hers. She thought about Silas Prout's filed nails and his silk waistcoat and the specific cruelty of men who operate in the gray spaces of the law. She thought about a man walking through a crowd and money on a table, and a voice saying she owes nothing to anyone. She thought about the porch at the boarding house in 17 Days, and the way the evening light had made his eyes look like deep water. She thought about James learning to walk early, Eleanor's certainty, William's noise, the deed to their house, the sign outside the shop, the way Edgar had looked at her with their son on his knee in the lamplight. She thought about the life they had built, chosen, made. Best decision I ever made too, she said. He reached over without ceremony and took her hand. His hand around hers, the same warmth as the first time, the same steadiness, the same quality of something absolute and true. They sat on the porch and watched the evening come over the prairie, and behind them the house was full of their children and their books and their life, and ahead of them the view was open and long and entirely theirs. Nothing owed, nothing taken, nothing forced, everything chosen, everything real, everything at last exactly enough.